Hey guys, it's Rose, and it is wrap-up time. It is September, which means it's fall, and I'm really excited about that. I love fall. I know I'm not exactly in the minority there, but it is one of my favorite seasons. You may have noticed that the hair has changed. My little rogue slash Damia streak is gone, and I have this lovely red hair again, which I always go back to, but it's also kind of fall related because it just suits the season, and I love it. So that's a little change. Other than that, all is normal, and it's time to talk about what I read in August. I'm going to start with The Age of Ice by J.M. Sidorova. I'm starting with this because I actually began reading it a couple of months ago, and it took me so long to finish. It's visually really pretty. I love, love, love this cover. On the inside, we have this beautiful blue map of Siberia, and altogether it looks like a really pretty book. I picked it up having only skimmed the inside cover, and I wish that I had read that a little more carefully, because if I had, I may not have picked it up. I saw that it was a historical fiction, and I read the Empress Anna Ionanova has issued her latest order, construct a palace out of ice blocks. The first paragraph of this little inside slipcover talks about an empress of Russia, and so I picked it up thinking, oh, this is a historical fiction about a Russian empress. That sounds right up my alley. If I had taken the extra 30 seconds to keep reading the entire front flap, I would have realized that it's actually about a young man in the Russian army, which is not up my alley. That said, it is a really interesting book. There's some really interesting quasi-supernatural concepts in here that I almost wish that the author had made more of, but they didn't. It really did kind of save it for me. The timing and the pacing also kind of put me off with this one. There are some parts that seem to just drag on and I'm not caring, and then suddenly it speeds up massively quickly and zooms past 30 years, and I'm left going, but I would have liked to, oh damn, that's done now. So it wasn't an amazing read, but it was kind of an interesting one, and it was outside of my wheelhouse, which is always interesting to read something that you don't normally do. Another historical fiction for the month, A Respectable Trade by one of my favorite authors, Philippa Gregory. There's not much to say about this except that I loved it because I love Philippa Gregory, and if you are a fan of her writing, you're probably going to like this as well. It's historical fiction set in the late 1700s in the UK. Part of it is also set in Africa and traveling through the slave plantations because it's based on the slave trade. That is the respectable trade here on the cover. Obviously, it's not actually that respectable trade, and it really just brings to life a certain period of history and a certain aspect of history and the slave trade and how it started to come to an end. So really interesting. If you love her books, if you like historical fiction, I would absolutely recommend it. My last historical fiction for the month is Lawrence Hill's The Book of Negros. Obviously, this is a very well-known book. If you haven't heard of it or read it, I would recommend it. There's a reason that it has won prizes and awards and been adapted and discussed at great length, and it's because it's an incredible book. Again, this is about the slave trade. I don't know why, for some reason this month I read 2 books about the slave trade. That just ended up happening, and I can't explain it. There was no conscious effort on my part to sit down and read these. They just happened to both appeal to me this month. Unlike the last book, A Respectable Trade, The Book of Negros talks about the same time period and obviously the same industry, but in North America rather than the UK. So while I didn't intend to read these together, I would actually recommend doing that because it was a really interesting way to see how this change was happening globally and not just in one spot. So they actually work really well as companion books. Who knew? Moving away from history, I picked up The Left Hand of God by Paul Hoffman. This was a really random pickup from the library sale shelves that I actually chose simply because Con Golden is endorsing it on the cover, and I love his books, so I wanted to take his recommendation. This marketing worked. I did not realize that this is the start of a series, which kind of bugged me because I try not to start new series often unless I know I'm willing to put the time and the effort and the money into getting and reading them all. So I was a little frustrated by that, but it actually works really quite well as a standalone. It doesn't end on a cliffhanger or anything that means that if you don't read the next one, you're really going to be missing out. However, it was so freaking good that now I want to read the rest of them because it was really amazing. It's very, very dark. It's very violent and brutal, and it's a fantasy series, a fantasy novel, focusing on a young boy who has been raised in this really awful, brutal kind of religious cult that centers around violence, that exists to train holy soldiers for a religious war in the fictional land. And he and a couple of friends manage to escape this horribleness and experience the world, and there's a lot of mystery and prophecy and violence and love and romance and hope and despair, and it's a really impressive book. I kind of picked it up not expecting much of it and loved it and read it in about 2 days because it was just so good. So I will be reading the rest of the series at some point. And I'm okay with the fact that I kind of feel like I got tricked into reading a new series because it doesn't say anywhere on it that it is like #1 in the series of X. But I'm okay with it because it was so good. Another one I read because I knew that I liked the author is The Crystal Skull by Manda Scott. Manda Scott actually wrote the Boudica or Boadicea series, which is an incredible series. I absolutely love it. I've read it a couple of times, and I'm probably going to do it again in the next few months because it's such a great series. This one is half historical and half modern fiction. It's definitely on the action-y thriller side of the spectrum, but it's also got a lot of supernatural elements to it. This would probably have been more compelling if I had read it when it was published quite a few years ago, because a lot of it is based on some of the prophecies and the Mayan prophecies centering on 2012. Obviously, we now know that the world did not end 3 years ago. Spoilers. So some of that element of it is lost, but it's still a really good book, and if you want to consider some of those end of the world prophecies as to do with the end of the world as we know it, then it's still going to be really interesting. It's definitely not as good as the Boudica series, but it was still an interesting read, and it was a quick read, and I can still confidently say that I do love the author for more than just that series, so it was worth it. Another book that's kind of part of a series is Dan Brown's The Lost Symbol. I say kind of part of a series because although this is connected to Angels and Demons and the Da Vinci Code, obviously Dan Brown's most famous books, I feel like you could read this completely separately and be fine with it. It's connected in that it follows Professor Langston, the same character that was in the first two, and it briefly references his work with symbols and the events of the books, but if you had not read them, this would not be any lesser because of it. It's very Dan Brown. It's quick and fast-paced, and there's lots of symbols and secret cults. This one is more to do with the Masons rather than the Illuminati. It's set primarily in Washington, and it's very Dan Brown. It's an easy read, and it's a fun read, and it's something that'll keep your interest and maybe make you think a little deeper about a couple of things. I really enjoyed the parallels that Dan Brown drew between the Masons and some of the rituals that we may look in at as being really weird and creepy. and rituals that we see as very normal, either as part of religions or part of everyday life. And I thought it was a really interesting look at the Masons, even outside of the story and the plot, and that was kind of cool. So if you like the first two, read this one. If you feel like it's an interesting topic and you don't remember anything about the first two, you don't need to reread them before you start this. Next up, we have Nose by James Conaway. This one I picked up along with Age of Ice during a major sale when Chapters was closing. I actually did a haul about these books, so I will put a link to that one below. Nose was actually a real disappointment. I had really, really hoped that it would be quite a bit of mystery and a little bit about wine. And it ended up being the other way around, and it almost ended up being less about wine and more about the culture of wine snobs. And it wasn't actually that fun. It was kind of a look at the kinds of people who are deeply involved in wine tasting and the wine industry in California, and who, by virtue of that, are as snobby as you might expect them to be, which was a bit of a shame, because I always kind of hope that if you take a look at a certain subculture like that, you're going to find out that the people there are relatable and nice and just like you and me, not, oh yeah, that's exactly how I thought they'd be, snobby and nasty. The mystery element really, really wasn't enough for me. It was a very predictable mystery, and it was really not the focus of the book at all, which I found quite sad. The other thing that bugged me about it is that the language in the book is very pretentious. It very much felt as though it was being dictated by the kind of cliched wine snob who uses big words just to show that they know what they mean. And I didn't like that. It felt a bit like the book was talking down to me. I can respect the fact that it's possible that Conaway did that very intentionally to try to further immerse the reader in the culture of wine snobbery, but it didn't make it a very enjoyable read. So I was kind of disappointed in that. I'm glad that I actually spent much less than this sticker. I think this book cost me about $2, and even then I'm not sure it was worth it. Then we have my favorite read of the month, which is the Millennium Trilogy by Stieg Larsson, otherwise known, or more popularly known, I think, as the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo books. And these books, I'm not going to hold them all up while I'm talking because they're pretty hefty tomes. These are incredible. These are so, so, so good. These are three that I'd been looking out for at garage sales and things for quite a while. I finally managed to get the full series. I was so excited to read it. I was not disappointed. Oh my god, they're so good. This full series, which is like, these are honking great books. I think I managed to read them in around about 56 hours, just because I couldn't put them down. If there was ever a book or a series that defined that phrase, it would be the Millennium Trilogy, because on each of those 3 days that I was reading these books, I basically sat up until I was done, and so I was going to bed at about 4 or 5 in the morning while reading them. So I would not start this trilogy if you have shit to do. I would start this if you have like a long weekend that you don't have anything planned on. Then these are some great reads. Otherwise, you are going to get distracted and do nothing else because, oh, they're so good. The suspense is incredible. The characters are incredible. I love the fact that the characters are so real, as in there's parts that, you really love and you relate to and you want to cheer for them, and then the character will do something that you're just left blinking in bafflement because that's a really dick move. They're deeply flawed and deeply relatable at the same time. The actual twists and turns of the plot are amazing. He covers issues of legality and court proceedings while making them seem really interesting, which is pretty hard to do, to be perfectly honest. and they're so good. I also want to mention that these were so good that this book, The Girl in the Spider's Web, has just been released, so I had to pick it up. I'm so excited to read this book. It is the 4th book in the series. It is written by someone else, by David Lagerkrantz, because Stieg Larsson unfortunately passed away, and they found this manuscript, and they found this Lagerkrantz gentleman to finish it in the same style. I am so excited to read this. I really, really hope it lives up to expectations. But that isn't really a wrap-up. I just wanted to mention it because it was sitting behind me and because I could rave about these books for multiple videos, and I'm really going to try not to. As usual, at the end of my wrap-ups, I like to talk about any comic books that I've read during the month because they count. Damn it, they do. First up, I've got the first volume in Ms. Marvel. This is the new Ms. Marvel, not Carol Danvers, who is now Captain Marvel, but easily confusable still. The new Ms. Marvel is a young girl called Kamala Khan. It's a really, really great new title. I'm really excited about it. I was excited about it to start with because it's a huge step forward for comic book diversity. We have someone who is, wait for it, not white and not Christian. We have a Muslim superhero. Holy crap. And I was really looking forward to reading it, but I had that little fear in the back of my mind that it wasn't actually going to be very good, and the only reason that it was going to be popular was because of this diversity element. Thankfully, that's not the case. It's really great in its own rights. There are a few volumes now published, so I will be picking up the rest of them in the coming months because I'm pretty excited to read the rest of it. I really like it. Finally, I also finally got around to rereading the 4th volume in the Age of Apocalypse series. This is a alternate timeline X-Men series. It is the same apocalypse that we will be seeing in the upcoming movie. However, it is a completely different timeline. This is a timeline where Charles Xavier is dead, Magneto is the good guy, Apocalypse kind of won, the Earth is being destroyed, the humans are enslaved, mutants are fighting against mutants, Scott Summers starts off as a bad guy, Rogue is with Magneto, that's just weird, all kinds of completely different things are going on, but I actually really enjoy that. I will admit to a weakness for standalone comic book events like Age of Apocalypse or Civil War, that you can sit down and read and it's not completely ongoing. It's just a nice balance sometimes from the kind of comic series that has been going for 40 years and that, let's face it, you're probably never going to catch up on having read absolutely everything connected to it. So I did really love this. I read it many, many years ago. I have the entire collection, and this was just something that I finally got around to rereading. And I love it. One more book to include that I don't have to hold up because I have it on my e-reader is, drumroll please, I finished A Dance with Dragons, which is the most recently released book in A Song of Ice and Fire, aka the Game of Thrones books, and it was awesome. I really loved it. I am kind of at a loss now that I'm up to date with that series, especially because it is an ongoing series, and that means I'm left hanging. I don't know what happens next, but it's really, really awesome to actually feel like I'm up to date with that. I feel like I can discuss it and theorize with people about it from a much more knowledge-based perspective rather than, It's also a really great book. The book previous to that I wasn't a big fan of. I found it was sort of focused on my least favorite characters and it dragged a bit, whereas Dance with Dragons brought that right back up again and made me excited, so I'm really stoked. I cannot wait for the next one to come out now. Like you, I have no idea when that's gonna be. Hopefully soon. And that is it for my August wrap-up. That brings me to a grand total of 13 books, 2 of which are comic books, and that's kind of my favorite number for a number of books read in a month. Partially because 13 is just my lucky number. I happen to like the number. Also, it just feels like a good solid amount of reading without being completely excessive and without feeling like I've been lazy. So I'm pretty stoked about this month. I hope you had an August of reading just as wonderful as mine was, and have a great day. Bye.